Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, senior editor at Forbes. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said Friday that Russia may be running out of time to convince the administration that it is serious about striking a peace deal with Ukraine. Joining us to discuss the ongoing developments in the Russia-Ukraine war is Tinatin Japaridze. She is a geopolitical risk analyst at the Eurasia Group. Tinatin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Maggie.
So, this past week, headlines have been dominated by President Trump's tariff announcements. But amid all of that, there is still a war in Russia and Ukraine, or between Russia and Ukraine, rather. Can you give us the 30,000-foot view of where we stand with this conflict for folks who may have let it fallen off their radar in the past few days and weeks?
Absolutely. And Maggie, you are definitely correct that the war is still very much ongoing. Both sides continue to assert that the other has not stopped strikes on their territory. So Russia is continuously accusing Ukraine of hitting, in particular, its energy infrastructure as of the last few days. And in Ukraine, we have seen a number of strikes on Ukrainian territory. And obviously, that is not ending anytime soon, for the time being at least. The war does continue, and the conversations surrounding a potential ceasefire have also not ended. But certainly, the ceasefire has not kicked in, and I think that we are still ways away from some sort of a tangible deal getting agreed upon by both sides.
Ways away from a tangible deal getting agreed on by both sides. So it was mid-March that it felt like we may have a ceasefire deal. How common is it for there to be a potential ceasefire deal and then several weeks later still be sitting with so many unknowns and ongoing conflict?
Well, initially, when the Trump administration took over, talks had picked up some momentum. There was a little bit of steam shortly thereafter, but the process was always going to be longer than perhaps what President Trump had anticipated, and certainly what he had told the media on record. He was planning to end the war in just a few days, but obviously, we are talking about two sides, with one of them in particular, Russia, definitely not in any sort of a rush to end the war, because they are still making the most of the gains, of the momentum, and they're not running out of steam just yet. Now, what we're seeing at the moment is that the process related to ceasefire talks is actually running into some big issues. There are a number of factors at play here, Maggie, but essentially these efforts are largely hampered by conflicting objectives among the different actors. So we have Russia and Ukraine, of course, given the huge distrust between them on so many levels, as well as the US and Europe, that have different and, in fact, increasingly conflicting objectives, which we can dissect at greater length later in this conversation. But it is worth pointing out here that the durability of a possible ceasefire remains questionable, even if some sort of a deal is reached over the next few months, which is still a possibility.
Durability remains questionable. I've spoken to other analysts who share that opinion, and one has told me that we may get a ceasefire in some shape or form, but for as long as Putin is alive, there will be conflict with Ukraine. What is your perspective on that statement?
Well, unfortunately, it seems to be the most accurate assessment, not just short and midterm, but also longer term. The possibility of a political settlement of the war and the broader conflict in 2025 or anytime soon, really, that results in the war formally ending is still very remote. Not in the least because even if a ceasefire is achieved this year, it's going to be fragile, I believe, and it is bound to break down very quickly, because at the end of the day, for Vladimir Putin, not only is he not in a rush to end the war, but also he does feel that his main objective will not be reached even if there is a ceasefire, because he does believe that Ukraine belongs not just with Russia, but in Russia. And he does not believe in Ukraine's sovereignty, its national identity, being completely independent from Russia. And that's why the reasons behind Vladimir Putin starting the war with neighboring Ukraine, they still continue to sadly inform his understanding and the understanding of a lot of people in his cabinet in the Kremlin.
That's a hard place for Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to negotiate from. What do you see as Zelensky's the doors he could take? Are there any?
Well, it very much depends, I think, what happens over the next couple of months. Because, firstly, as I said earlier, we cannot entirely rule out the possibility of a limited ceasefire later this year. I think that is still a possibility. If you had to ask me, I think that is more likely than no deal whatsoever. But by the same token, I think there are two main ways that this could pan out over the next few months, which in turn will inform how Zelensky acts and what he has to do. So if Ukraine continues to face troop shortages, which, as you know, Maggie, has been a pressing problem for the Ukrainian forces, and there is more uncertainty over U.S. military aid, then this will put the Ukrainian army and Ukraine more broadly in a very difficult position through the summer and into the fall, which in turn will result in increased pressure on President Zelensky, not just abroad and sort of coming from abroad, but also domestically, to perhaps settle for a deal that is less than ideal, mildly speaking, for the Ukrainian side. Ukrainians are not ready to give in, certainly they're not. But at the same time, he will have to be pragmatic and figure out, depending on how desperate he is in that moment in time, of what is it that he needs to give up and whether or not giving something up will ensure that his position will stay intact, because that will be a very, very hard sell for him at home. Now, should Europe be able to fill a substantial portion of the void that may be left by the US in terms of helping Ukraine stabilize the situation on the battlefield, then we may see a more, I don't want to use the word flexible, but perhaps a more pragmatic Putin, who is actually going to be interested in holding talks, which does not seem to be the case at the moment, at least not in terms of ceasefire negotiations, because he appears to be far more interested in bilateral normalization with the US rather than ending the war in Ukraine anytime soon, at least not right now.
Does that get to the conflicting objectives between the US and the EU that you referenced earlier in our conversation?
It does, to a degree, absolutely. I think with the new Trump administration, there are very different perspectives that the US is taking vis-a-vis Ukraine, vis-a-vis Europe, compared to what we've been seeing in Brussels and elsewhere in Europe. And I'm not just talking about the European Union as a bloc, but even countries like the United Kingdom, for example, that is not part of the EU. I think the two sides, Europe and the US, are for the first time, and we all, of course, know this, sadly, they are not on the same wavelengths on a lot of things. And one of those pressing issues is, unfortunately, Ukraine. And it's very difficult to find some sort of a consensus on the bigger picture when it comes to how the West broadly should be supporting Ukraine. Just one more thing I'll mention here is, before, at least a lot of my colleagues, analysts, as well as historians, used to talk about the collective West. Perhaps they would talk about Western Europe here and there and the US separately, but really we would talk about the West, Western response. Unfortunately, those lenses and that particular lens is not very hopeful at the moment, just given this rift between Washington and Brussels and others in Europe in terms of how to approach these issues, especially security-related issues.
It makes me wonder if we're entering into a new normal wherein we can't talk about a unified West. Is it too soon to say that, or what's your assessment there?
I think it may be too soon for us to say what the new normal is going to look like, but it is not too soon to say that what we've known thus far is changing, what has been taught in international relations classes, for example, as a former student. When I look back on, 5, 10, 15 years ago, what I was taught in college, as well as university, all of that now I'm having to rethink because those lenses are not that they're not useful anymore, but the landscape is changing so very quickly that we also have to adapt our perspectives. Obviously, history always ends up informing how we assess not only the present, but also the future. But that said, everything is moving at such a crazy speed at the moment that it's really, really hard to not just keep up with how much is happening at the same time simultaneously, but also which particular perspective and which particular lens we should be using when looking at a given problem.
Now, Tinatin, you mentioned that Putin seems to have an interest in bilateral normalization with the US, and we've seen that the Trump administration appears open to that. In terms of the conversations that we've seen from the American president with the Russian president, some of the readouts we've gotten of those calls, and some of the sources we've been talking to at Forbes have said that in order to make a meaningful step in ceasefire negotiations, President Trump would have to take a harder line on Russia. What's your response to that?
The really interesting question here is, as we've been observing over the last few weeks, where ceasefire talks are going, very quickly, within a couple of days, I would say, after the US president's inauguration, we realized that actually we're not just talking about that single track ceasefire related conversation, but rather there's two different tracks, Maggie. So one is definitely the Russia-Ukraine ceasefire talks that we already discussed, but then the other one, and one that I do think Putin is far more interested in, and perhaps I would argue even Trump to a degree in terms of a quick win is interested in this one, and that is US-Russia bilateral negotiations. The two tracks don't necessarily go hand in hand, nor do they serve the same objective, but there is still some occasional overlap. But we've got bilateral talks between Putin and Trump, essentially dominating conversations, at the very least in Moscow, if not one of the dominating conversations in Washington, particularly within the immediate circle of President Trump. Now, in terms of the likelihood, I think that there is still some room for the two sides, Moscow and Washington, to be able to finalize at least broad strokes outlines of a bilateral deal on perhaps security issues, economic normalization. I do think that ceasefire related and broadly Ukraine war related topics will be baked into this, but it's not probably going to be one of the first 2, 3 issues that Trump and Putin continue to discuss. Again, we would have to think about durability. What sort of a pact could withstand such, let's say, dynamic figures like Trump and Putin, who also tend to change their minds about certain ways that they assess certain situations and where that relationship stands in terms of what is one trying to gain from the other. And then we sort of get into this whole game theory. And I think talking about school and academia that we mentioned earlier, I do think that certain theories and certain lenses are actually going to be very helpful now. And it's one that I am particularly fascinated by when I look at how Putin and Trump and their immediate circles are negotiating with each other and who has that upper hand. I would argue that that changes with every meeting that the two sides hold, with every conversation that's being held between these two entities, so to speak. And I do feel that it'll be very difficult for us to predict where that goes, but it is still easier for us to decouple ceasefire-related talks from bilateral talks between Russia and the United States, because there will be objectives that the likes of Vladimir Putin will actually prioritize, because there are questions of, for example, sanctions. There's a question of trade and tariffs more specifically that undoubtedly is going to be dominating conversations in Moscow, and how the Russian side continues to negotiate with the U.S. side.
To that point, the U.S. imposed economic sanctions on Russia in 2022. And amid all of the countries on President Trump's tariff lists that he produced last week and announced from the White House, Russia was not on that list. And a lot has been made of that fact. But it seems to be that the Oval Office is saying, well, it's because we imposed economic sanctions on Russia back in 2022. From your perspective as a geopolitical analyst, what is the significance of that, and how helpful have the economic sanctions been in containing Russia's actions?
So, on your first question, Maggie, I do think that there is a degree of truth and reality in terms of the realistic situation at the moment, in terms of what sort of a justification could be used for why Russia was not included on that list. Having said that, it's also inevitably going to be part of sort of that broader leverage that President Trump hopes to have over Putin, in terms of showing him that, look, we did not include you in the list because we do feel that there is a conversation to be had. We are having that conversation. We are continuing those negotiations. And until those negotiations are over, we essentially will not be imposing any draconian sanctions on you until we know where this is moving. But then, of course, within a few hours, the Trump administration is very likely, and we've seen that happen, to come out with a statement that essentially contradicts that message and says that if Russia does not do X by Y, then we are going to see this set of sanctions and this set of sort of tariffs and other threats, essentially. So this continuation of seeing carrots and sticks, mostly from the US side. Obviously, Russia is on the receiving end of it, because in many ways, the Russian side feels that Moscow has more leverage over President Trump. Of course, if you ask President Trump's office, they will tell you the complete opposite, that it is Washington that has more leverage over Moscow. So this game that we're watching, a little bit of ping pong, I think, is going to continue inevitably, and sanctions do play a role here. As you recall, Maggie, there were a number of statements, in fact, coming out of Washington after President Trump's inauguration that essentially posited and even promised that there would be some sort of sanctions, not lifting, but easing. I do feel that short term, any sort of wide sanctions easing is still going to be quite unlikely. But what we may see instead, speaking of carrots, but sort of a partial carrot here, is a potential non-enforcement by the US side, which is more probable as one of the sort of possible ways to keep Putin interested, to essentially bring him to the table, because I do think that he's halfway to the table, but not really at the table yet. And it's always very interesting to me to watch whom is he deploying to a given conversation or meeting with the US side. He is still waiting it out to see when he's going to pull out the really big sort of cards, as far as he's concerned. And I think he's partly cautious because, on the one hand, he wants to see how the war is going to unfold. And I'm talking specifically about how Russia is performing on the battlefield. And on the other hand, he wants to see what's happening globally and where the US is at in terms of its placement in this global conversation, and with so much changing in terms of trade and tariffs and just the overall order that you referenced, Maggie. I think that is something that that Putin is watching very closely. So he does zoom in every now and then, but he also is looking at the broader picture, and he wants to make sure that the cards that he's been dealt are going to be used in a very, very smart way. So we're probably likelier to see some sort of a substantial easing of sanctions vis-a-vis Russia from the United States in the event of a workable ceasefire. But for as long as that ceasefire in a tangible sense is not in one's hands just yet, I think the rest will be mostly words, and in Donald Trump's case, mostly promises to keep Putin engaged.
You raised so many interesting points there. And on the point about leverage and diplomatic leverage, we've had conversations at Forbes with folks about the DOGE cuts, the cuts to U.S. aid, and about diplomacy through development, and how America's position in the world could be changing because of some of these cuts. And if we're removing programs that are used to foster good international relations. So perhaps this is too much of a crystal ball type question, but is the US a key towards peace in Ukraine, or is Europe or a different bloc or entity going to emerge as the more important figure in that negotiation?
I do agree that it's definitely a crystal ball type of a question, but I'll take a crack at it nonetheless. 6 months ago, Maggie, I would have given you a very different answer. I would have said that it was going to be mostly the US that is going to move the needle, and then Europe will follow. Sadly, I don't think that is the case anymore. I do think that there is an awareness in Europe at this point that they have to act individually, individual countries, that is, in Europe, but also as a bloc, the European Union, because inevitably the dangers and the threats, the risks that Europe is facing, if everything really gets to the point where it's out of control vis-a-vis Ukraine, and Russia is so emboldened that Putin's appetite continues to get bigger and bigger, and he wants more, then he's no longer going to stop at Ukraine. He is no longer even going to stop at countries like Georgia, for example, or Moldova. And there will be that threat of waking up in a very dangerous, very insecure in terms of security architecture, Europe, that I don't think that the European Union was ready to think about before, partly because they always had an ally like the United States that was going to be there for them, and they had that backing that I'm not entirely sure is there anymore. So this sobering moment has changed a lot on the European continent more broadly. There are conversations that are no longer just being had about the long term, but rather on the short and mid-term situation and what can be done, what should be done. So in many ways, Europe will be acting in a way that is far more independent of the United States, I feel, than it would have been 6 months to 12 months ago under the different Biden administration. And that's bound to change. And perhaps as a silver lining, this is a sobering moment that will be a silver lining for Europe, because they have to understand that a lot of the threats emanating from Russia are also local in nature, and not being aware of the fact that Putin could wake up in a very different mood, and he could be even more emboldened with what he's able to get in Ukraine, that he could decide that he wants to act and go further into Europe. If that happens, it is, of course, imperative for Europe to be ready really yesterday and not tomorrow, because we simply don't know when that tomorrow, when it comes to Putin and what he does next, is going to come.
So many questions, more questions than answers, I fear, on the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. But Tinatin Japaridze, global political risk analyst at Eurasia Group, thank you for answering what you can at this point in this conflict. We will have to have you back as negotiations continue to unfold. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.